Welcome to Professor Russell Esposito's channel on information security. This video is just one of many video modules that are part of Professor Esposito's course on the subject. Video modules for his entire information security course are located on this channel. So remember to hit the like button as well as subscribe if you enjoy the video. Thank you for watching.
Cryptography. As you can see, this module, this is a rather lengthy module. There are about 31 slides. There's a lot of information in here. So we're going to go through quite a number of different subjects that revolve around cryptography and some related subjects. So I'm not going to read this list to you, but we'll start through. But just to sort of give you a little bit of a preview, it's a little bit longer presentation with 31 slides as opposed to maybe 20 or 15. Let's start with the benefits of cryptography. You may remember from one of our earliest videos, this NIST triangle here, this integrity, availability, confidentiality, the three sort of pillars of security. The data has to maintain its integrity. It's got to be accurate and complete. It's got to be available to the users. And it has to be confidential. It has to be kept private. But there's a balance, right? It's confidential. You need some confidentiality or encryption, but it can't be kept so confidential that it's not available. All right, so now if we keep that in mind, this was the NIST three pillars or three primary components of any security system or a framework or security policies. Now let's look at cryptography benefits. They sort of overlap. The first piece is integrity. Cryptography allows you to encrypt data, lock it up so that it can't be changed and that it can't be read. Well, it's not so much it can't be read yet. It's data integrity, that you know that the data hasn't changed during transmission, essentially. So we're going to look at this in more detail, but data integrity involves really the data being intact, complete, and accurate during the transmission, and when it's received by the recipient, there's some guarantees that the data was the same data the way it was sent by the sender. So that's data integrity. So that matches the NIST triangle, the blue piece of the triangle on the left. The next one, cryptography, gives us authentication. You're assured about who the participants are, who sent the communication, who's receiving the communication. So it's a little different than availability. It's deeper than that. It actually not just provides for availability, but it provides authentication, so you know who the sender and receivers are. All right, that sort of matches up somewhat with the red section of the triangle on the left. And the third one is confidentiality. So again, the data is encrypted, it's private, it's kept through encryption. So encryption gives integrity, makes sure encryption, really these are called hashes. We'll learn more about this later on. But the encryptology ensures data integrity from when the data was sent to when it was received. It ensures authentication of who the senders and receivers are. It provides confidentiality that the data can't be seen or spied on in some way that it could be read and interpreted and understood. It's encrypted. So there's the first three things of encryption, benefits of encryption, basically cryptography. And the third one is non-repudiation. The sender can't deny they sent the message. So this cryptography and cryptology, encryption, whatever you want to call it, provides this concept of non-repudiation. It becomes very important with electronic signatures, of course, right? If you think about that. So those are the four main benefits of cryptography, and they somewhat align with the three very basic core, the foundations of security according to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So let's look at some basic terms, which I think are fairly self-explanatory. Plain text, unencrypted messages. Also known as, aka, also known as text in the clear. It's not encrypted. A human can read it. A cipher is an algorithm used to encrypt or decrypt information. So that's the encryption algorithm, encryption mathematics. The key works with the algorithm to encrypt and decrypt. So the key is an important part that sort of turns on the encryption and allows it for the math to occur, and de-encrypt, the key sort of unlocks, de-encrypts the the ciphertext, the scrambled text back into plain text. Ciphertext is the next term. That's the encrypted text, or the encrypted message. And cryptanalysis is not really part of this course, but just so you've heard the term and you understand it, it's the art of cracking encryption. And there's two types, differential and linear, but sort of beyond the scope of this course. Let's review what's called Chekhov's cryptography principle. And people sort of have this feeling or the sense that keys or the encryption algorithms, the mathematics that does the encryption should be kept secret. It's not. So the generally used encryption that's on the internet, these algorithms are publicly accessible. And it's that way so that researchers can look at them, that someone can make them more sophisticated, more complexity, add nuances to the way the math works, improve upon it. I know there's cryptology and encryption algorithms that the military and others use that are not publicly accessible. But for commercial purposes, they're publicly accessible. What needs to be kept private is the key, not the algorithm. The key that unlocks it and locks it. The key that matches up with the algorithm to encrypt the text, and the key is used to decrypt the text. Okay, so that's the important principle here. The algorithm is not secret, but the key needs to be kept secret. All right, and we'll explain some variations on that as we get deeper in the course. There are essentially two types of ciphers or encryption algorithms, right? One is a substitution cipher, the top half of the slide, and the bottom one is a transposition cipher. You don't need to know the details of this. It's just really, again, for your edification and for those who are interested. But substitution ciphers go back to Julius Caesar. I'm sure before that, but he really sort of used ciphers extensively and made encrypted messaging more popularized or understood as a standard military tactic. And the substitution ciphers essentially substitute different letters for other letters. So if you look at the first bullet here on the substitution cipher, a D becomes an A. So there's a whole system to that, right? That certain letters are replaced with others. They're substituted. And there are some other sort of examples here that I won't get into, but those are interested. These are sort of more common things you can do some research on if you're interested. The other is transposition cipher, where you keep the words in the text and just scramble them up. All right. So in this first bullet here, they talk about hello world. If you scramble it up, it looks like HLOOLEWRD. So this is just a transposition cipher. And there's hackers who look to break transposition ciphers. One of the things they use is frequency analysis. This is the last bullet. Well, they say, what are the most common letters in the alphabet? E's and T's and A's are the most common. They'll look to see if they can identify, the patterns, the way these work together in English, and try to decipher it that way. So these are just two kinds of ciphers. The ciphers today that are used are very sophisticated and much more complex, and use a combination of these plus many other techniques. Here are a few other types of ciphers. There are just mechanical ciphers. Probably the most famous one is Germany's Enigma machine used in World War II to scramble their military messages that were being transmitted. And here's a little picture of an Enigma machine from World War II. Mechanical ciphers are the most common in modern times. Mathematical ciphers are the most common in modern times. Employ complex algorithms. It's not simply substitution, or transposition ciphers. They become very complicated mathematical algorithms. Probably one of the safest ciphers is a standard notepad where someone provides a message, provides a manual explanation to how to understand this. Nobody else knows the pattern. No one else knows the how to descramble the code, but these two people, and they may memorize, what the pattern is and destroy it. So it's never communicated over the internet. It's manual. It's not something that's scalable, but it's still considered a formidable plain text cipher, a one-time plain text or cipher text on a notepad that someone just writes down, their scrambled message, They write down, this is how you descramble it. They destroy the descrambling paper, burn it or whatever, and they have a very secret way of something that can't be easily descrambled. But again, it's uncommon. But I would imagine, in the spy versus spy world, this is still happening. And then, of course, Microsoft has a whole cipher library where there, lots and lots of these are available with APIs, application program interfaces. So these algorithms, as I said earlier, they're not secret, they're publicly accessible, and there isn't anything that would prevent someone from using them, analyzing them, changing them, and deploying them. In fact, just as a side note, during World War II, I'm not sure how many of you know what the United States used as a cipher technique. They used the Navajo language. The Native American Navajo language was used in some variations as well to scramble our military messages that were being transmitted and transported, and using something that is sort of random in the sense of there's no pattern to it, right? They're just using the Navajo language with some other changes to that to make it very difficult to decipher. So modern cryptology uses advanced mathematics, and there are two types. And again, this is sort of beyond the scope of this class, but I want you to understand there are pseudo-random generators, sort of inappropriate and no longer considered safe, and what's also called non-deterministic number generators. Now, the reality is these are very advanced, random number generators, but they're not truly random, right? Nothing is really fully random because it's still a mathematical algorithm that's creating the scrambling. So it's not like rolling two dice and it's totally random, but the mathematics makes them close to randomness. And the way you measure randomness is a term, the last term on the slide, called entropy. The more random it is, the more difficult it is for someone to decipher it, has a higher level of entropy. The amount of, in this case, it means randomness when you're talking about ciphers and encryption algorithms. So again, this is sort of beyond the scope of this class. I just want you to understand there are different types, pseudo and non-deterministic. Nothing is truly random because it's still a mathematical formula that's creating it, but they're so advanced that they appear to be close to random with high entropy. So we know that encryption scrambles up messages, but they're not hidden. When cryptography becomes the practice of hiding information, it becomes stenography. Now, whether it's encrypted, scrambled information or not, hiding the information is the science of steganography. Okay, so this is a very common technique used among hackers. They hide viruses within MP3 files or MP4 files, images, video files, and you become infected by the fact that there's an executable that's hidden within this image. So this, if you go back to the old legend of the Greek Trojan horse, right, where during the Trojan War, the Greeks hollowed out, built this horse that was full of soldiers, essentially. They pretended to have sort of given up on the war, presented this horse as a gift, and when the Trojans let the horse into the gates of the city, the soldiers came out from inside the hollow horse and attacked them. So they're hidden. It's a perfect example of steganography, but it's not information as much as in this case it was actual soldiers. So encryption is the scrambling of something. Steganography is the hiding of that message within a video file, an image file, a sound file, so that you become infected like the Trojan horse infected the Trojans with the Greek soldiers. Hash functions. So a hash function is a type of encryption, but it's one way. This is something that it's a algorithm that encrypts something and there's no key to decrypt it. So this is often used for passwords. Your passwords are encrypted when they're stored. When you log on again, the first time you create a password, it gets encrypted and stored. When you go to log on a second time, you type in your plain text password and it gets encrypted, and now that encrypted version has to match what's stored in the database to allow you to get in. So that's how that all works. They're stored in this what's called a hash. This one-way encryption is called a hash because there's no key to decrypt it, and you don't want a key to decrypt passwords if they're stolen, right? You don't want to have any possibility of somebody having a key obtained from anywhere to de-encrypt it. Infrequently, but it's possible, and it's called a collision, and hackers will, if a hacker uses this, it's called a birthday attack. In the middle of this paragraph, you kind of see a birthday attack. And that's when two different terms, when they're hashed, it could be brown cat, it could be white dog. When they're hashed, they create the same result, the same encrypted hash message. Very rare, but it happens. And they call it a birthday attack because, you know, that statistic, if there are 23 people in a room, there's a possibility that over 50% of them will have the same, there's a 50% chance that at least two of them will have the same date of birth. So put 23 people in a room, there's over a 50% chance that two of them will have the same date of birth. The birthdays collide. And in this case, the mathematics is not perfect. Remember we said earlier, this is not a completely, totally, purely randomization when things are encrypted. There's this, you know, it simulates it, but it's highly random, but it's not completely random. So it could happen, and we'll learn more about how this birthday attack, this collision, can sometimes allow a hacker to get access into a system. But well-designed hashes don't do that. The most common ones we'll learn about are, you know, MD5 and SHA-256 and these other, you know, kinds of algorithms that do one-way encryptions. So they don't do this often, but it can happen. A hash could also be used, and this is in the second to last bullet here, to create integrity in a message. So I have a message. It's got a header, it's got an IP address, it's got a timestamp, a date, it's got my payload, my actual message, all the values in there. They're all binary, of course, and they're all added up to sort of a grocery store total. So they all get added up and they get hashed, and it becomes sort of a fingerprint or like a unique identifier for that message. The message gets sent with this hash total. When the receiving computer gets it, it recalculates the hash, and the hash has to match. If it doesn't match after the recalculation, it knows that something changed. The payload, the message, the information in the data that was transmitted was corrupted or changed somehow, and it asks for another resend of the message. So the hash provides this data integrity. So it's used for hiding, encrypting passwords, I should say encrypting passwords, and it's also used for data integrity as well. It's impossible to recover or decrypt the original message from the hash. There is no key. It's hashed one way, unlike when you send your social security or your credit card number to, you know, an online store where you're shopping. It gets encrypted, it gets sent over, it gets de-encrypted by the e-commerce site, and they know your credit card number. This is not like that. Hash is a one-way encryption with no key to decrypt it. So we talked about the purpose of hashes, right? One-way encryption, used to store passwords and for data integrity, receipts, sort of totals, fingerprints on a transmission, a data transmission. These are the most common MD5, the SHA versions, SHA. These are the algorithms that do this one-way encryption without a key. Encrypted, it stays encrypted. And these are the ones that are most commonly used on the internet. In the earlier presentation, we talked about three different acronyms, MAC, M-A-C, used three different ways in this business of security, right? And the third one was MAC, or sometimes HMAC, hash-based message authentication code. Now, this is typically the most common one. This is a mathematical algorithm. It's called HMAC SHA-256. It's a hashing algorithm. It's math. And the math is going to ensure data integrity, that the data is complete that was transmitted, and authenticity. We know who it came from. And it sort of creates like this fingerprint we talked about earlier by adding up all the information in a data packet, the header, the IP address, the time, the payload, you know, the actual data that's being transmitted, adds it all up and puts it through this mathematical scrambling hash mathematics to create this encrypted value, right? And this mathematical algorithm is used in this IPsec, which we're going to learn more about, Internet Protocol Security, IPsec, commonly used in virtual private networks, VPNs. We talked about that, VPNs in an earlier module. And it's also used in HTTPS. You know, when you open a browser, you got the URL and you see the little HTTPS preceding it, IBM.com or Amazon.com. Prior to that, you see HTTPS. That S means secured. And that HTTPS protocol is invoking the SSL/TLS encryption protocol to ensure that encryption is happening, and the mathematical algorithm being used is HMAC. So it's sort of a nesting of protocols, right? There's a suite of protocols in the internet. It's not just one protocol that does one thing. The hypertext, HTTPS, secured hypertext, that invokes the encryption protocols of SSL/TLS, and that's using the math based on HMAC, if you understand that. But the bottom line to remember here is that HMAC is a hash-based mathematical algorithm to create a one-way scrambled message with no key to de-encrypt it, okay? And that's used for certain purposes, for data integrity and for authenticity. It's not going to be used for when you send your credit card over, because your credit card is going to be scrambled, encrypted, but it's got to get de-encrypted on the other end when Amazon gets it or Walmart. So that would not be using HMAC. HMAC is more for, for passwords, for data integrity, for proving who you are, but not for data that's got to be de-encrypted on the other end when it's received, because HMAC is a one-way encryption with no key to decrypt it. We're going to look at other encryption methods that will be used for transmitting data that has to be encrypted for transmission and de-encrypted by the recipient. So we talked about HMAC for encrypting passwords and creating data fingerprints on a data packet, so you know that it's complete. The hash gets created when the transmission is started. It gets sent with the message, and that hash gets recalculated by the recipient. If it matches the original calculation, the original hash, then the recipient knows the data has its complete integrity. Right? It gets hashed, creates this fingerprint, gets transmitted. The receiver recalculates the hash. So like a grocery total, if it adds up again, it knows all the items are in the basket. Nothing was corrupted in that transmission. That's the hash we talked about in the previous slide. Now, what happens when you need to send, your credit card, your address? A hash won't work because that's a one-way encryption. There's no key to de-encrypt it. Now we're going to talk about symmetric encryption and asymmetric encryption. These have keys. See the little pictures of the keys? Your information gets encrypted. It gets de-encrypted and read and stored by Amazon, Walmart, whoever it is, the Bank of America. So let's talk about symmetric first. That's actually where one key is used to encrypt and the same key is used to decrypt. Okay, that's symmetric. Sounds like it should be called symmetric. Asymmetric is there's two different keys that are mathematically connected, two different keys. One key encrypts the data, one key de-encrypts it. A different key de-encrypts it. So we're going to look at how this works, but it could be there's a public key and a private key, and we're going to explain that as we go further into it, how this works in what's called a public key infrastructure. So there's a private key that's kept secret, and there's a public key that anyone can use. Essentially, when you go to the bank, or let's say you're shopping on Amazon or Walmart or some site like that, that site's going to have a public and a private key. It's going to keep the private key private, but it's going to send you the public key. You're going to encrypt your address, your phone number, your credit card. You encrypt it with the public key. You send it back to Amazon. Amazon gets the encrypted data, de-encrypts it with that private key. Private key's got to be kept secret and private. That's not for public use, because then anyone can decrypt anyone else's message. So that's kind of how this public key infrastructure works. And there are these digital certificates from third parties that provide the keys. Amazon pays for Entrust or Symantec or someone to provide them the keys to validate that their website is in fact owned by Amazon. So you have this sort of, when you see that that all that HTTPS in the top of the URL, it has all these nested sets of protocols to do encryption. And this particular encryption requires de-encryption, whether it's asymmetric with 2 different keys or symmetric with 1 key. But the certificate, and we'll learn more about that later on, the company, or it could be a college, or it could be any company or a hospital system or a school district. They're going to get these keys and this validation, these digital certificates that proves who they are. They've gone through some validation process with this vendor who said, okay, you're really the XYZ school district, you're really the XYZ hospital, you're really Amazon, and I'm going to provide you these keys that provide high level of encryption for encryption and de-encryption in this asymmetric situation. So that's the 2 basic types of keys for encryption and decryption. Now let's go to the next section and get a little bit clearer understanding of this. So RSA, named after the inventors, the names here at the top of the towards the top of the paragraph here, in 1977, RSA is by far the most common asymmetric encryption that's used on the internet. So when you have a URL on the top of your browser that says HTTPS, it's using these protocols called SSL TLS, and they're going to invoke RSA when they need to use asymmetric encryption. So asymmetric encryption does a lot of things, right? It encrypts with the public-private key we talked about earlier. It provides confidentiality because of the encryption. It provides data integrity. It provides authenticity. We know who logged on, and non-repudiation, which means that if you send something, you can't say you didn't send it, or if you did not send it, you can't say you did not send it. Or if you signed a digital contract, an e-contract, you can't say you didn't sign it. So that's the basic premise of this. And let's look at a little picture of this. There's also RSA uses what's called an initialization vector, which also gives it some more randomness to prevent repetition with data encryption. It's sort of a fine point. Don't worry about this initialization vector, but just so you know it's there. Let's look at a picture of how this works. Here's an example of asymmetric encryption using RSA, which is the most common. So if you look at, this is asymmetric, 2 different keys being used. If you look at the top, there's a sender and a receiver, right? The left-hand side, there's a message that has to be sent. It says to be or not to be, that is the question, Shakespeare obviously. The unencrypted message on the left. The person on the left side of this graph gets a public key from the receiver. See the right-hand side of the dashed line, it says receiver. That's who's going to receive this message. But the receiver has a public and private key that starts out on the right side of this diagram. When this person connects to the bank, the person on the left-hand side with the message that has to be sent, they pull down the public key. The person who's going to receive this gives them the public key. Their computer sends the public key, the blue key. With that public key, they encrypt their credit card number, their address, whatever it is. And you can see it's scrambled in the middle of this page here, in the middle of this picture, encrypted message. Then when it's received by the bank, the receiver has that private key that they keep and no one else has. And now they can de-encrypt anyone, this customer or any other customer, that encrypted data with their public key, the blue key that they give out. You go to a bank, you go to Amazon, they have the public and private key, they send you the public key, they send all their customers the public key. They encrypt with the public key. They send the message to the facility, bank, or or hospital, or Amazon or Walmart, and Walmart and these companies have that private key. They de-encrypt it, and they have the message to the right, to be or not to be, completely de-encrypted by the private key. So these 2 keys work together. One's used for the public, all of their customers, and one is kept private, the green key that no one else can have but the owner of that site. This company's got those digital certificates that's given to them, authenticates who they are, gives them these proper keys that provide strong encryption, and they use the public-private key process to provide this public encryption called PKI, the public key infrastructure.
HTTPS
the S after the P here is the shows that this is the protocol that initiates a security protocol, SSL or TLS, which are pretty synonymous now, those two security protocols. They work exactly the same essentially now that SSL has been upgraded. And that kicks off the RSA public encryption key request. So you can see the user on the right-hand side. Step one is getting the public key. And this whole process is HTTPS kicks off SSL TLS, one of those protocols, and that asks for the RSA public encryption key to download the public key for the user. Step two is obviously after you've encrypted your data, ID, password, credit card number. Step two is passing the encrypted message to the web server, and the web server has the private key to de-encrypt it. Let's look at the next step, asymmetric encryption with Diffie-Hellman. So here's where it gets interesting, right? We talked about asymmetric keys, how the holder of the public and private key, the Bank of America, let's say, has a public and private key. They send the public key out to anyone and any customer. And with decrypts, sends the message back to the bank decrypts with the private key. It gets a little bit more complicated when Diffie-Hellman is used, because Diffie-Hellman uses those asymmetric keys that are created by RSA, the RSA asymmetric we saw in the previous slide. But instead of just sending the key over, it does something to the key in using the special exchange protocol of Diffie-Hellman. That's really not sending the key. It's really using those keys and combining them into a symmetric key. But the keys never communicate. So let's look at the colors here. This sounds a little confusing, but let's look at the colors. So Bob and Alice, the colors make it a little bit simpler than looking at numbers, right? Bob and Alice have a common key, common paint, yellow. But they also have asymmetric, different keys. Alice has red, Bob has what looks like green. Those are never exchanged over the internet. The red and the green never, if you notice, they never pass over. Alice combines her yellow and red and gets brown. Bob combines his yellow and green and gets blue. But now they exchange those items. They didn't exchange their secret colors, right? The red and the green. They exchanged a combination of other things. So now Alice has the blue and Bob has the brown on the right hand side. Follow me now? Now Alice then adds again in her red, her secret key, gets brown. Bob on the right hand side takes that tan, brownish, that tan color, and adds his green in his secret key again and gets that dark brown on the bottom again. So now they have a common key they can use. They both can use this key, but those keys never went over the internet, right? Their secret keys, their secret colors were red and green. They never exchanged them over the internet. So Diffie-Hellman is a way to take asymmetric keys and use them in a way that you can exchange these keys without ever really passing these secret keys over the internet. So it's really it's an interesting way to do that, to exchange keys. So it's really an exchange protocol. That's what Diffie-Hellman is. How do you exchange keys in a way that's completely secret, that the key never goes over the internet? Okay, so that's how Diffie-Hellman works, and it's used with RSA. It's used in combination with other kinds of encryption. Again, it's this suite of protocols. It may be sometimes a little bit unclear how they all mesh together, but just understand how each one individually works, because they're used in lots of different combinations. So we learned about Diffie-Hellman. There's also elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman, ECDH, elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman. See at the top, ECDH at the top right hand side. And really all this is saying is that phones that don't have a tremendous amount of processing power, mobile devices, they're using this elliptical curve geometry, algebraic mathematics to generate the key with less processing. That's all it means. So it's still the Diffie-Hellman key exchange process, but it's using this algebraic, mathematical, elliptical curve process to calculate it more efficiently. That's all the elliptical curve variation. This is very common. ECDH, elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman, is very common on the internet. Diffie-Hellman by itself, not so common, but the elliptical curve version, very common. We learned about Diffie-Hellman. We learned about the more efficient elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman, ECDH. Now we're going to add an E to the back of that. This is a sort of an evolution, the variations, but this is sort of, I'm helping you understand how this evolved into what's typically used. ECDHE, elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, right? And the reason that this is sort of the ultimate of the Diffie-Hellman sequence or evolution is that it provides what they call perfect forward secrecy. And what that means is these keys are unique. They're used once for every session. They're not repeated. So if somehow it gets one session or one key or one message gets decrypted, gets compromised, that key can't be used for maybe previous messages that were stolen and stored, or future messages. That key is only good for that one transaction, that one transmission, that one piece of that session. So that's why they call it perfect forward secrecy. Basically, it's saying this key is used once. If it's compromised in some way, and this hacker has been stealing data but has not been able to de-encrypt it, but now today they got this key, they got this data, they de-encrypted it, they can't go back and all their stored data that they've stolen for the last 6 months and decrypt that, because the keys are all different. And transactions it may be stealing in the future also cannot be decrypted because each transaction has a different key. So that's this ephemeral use once key. So it's a little different than the second bullet here with the typical private public key asymmetric keys, right? If the private key is compromised, if someone finds or steals the private key, they can decrypt everything, future, past data that they had stolen and stored, future data. So the elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman ephemeral encryption is much more secure. So we're sort of building up, as you could see, into this more complicated, a process. And to sort of reemphasize the thought, right, of this ephemeral key that's used once, in the first paragraph here, it says that, right, constantly generating new keys for each session, each message, phone call, browser page load. So it's very secure because every key is different. If you decrypt a key in a message, you can't go to the prior messages that you may have stolen to decrypt them, right? That's the last sentence of the first paragraph. It's only used once. And now what the second paragraph here explains, it doesn't authenticate the parties, right? It doesn't prove who they are. So it's more prone to a potential man-in-the-middle attack, MITM, which is why it has to be used with the last sentence here in combination with additional authentication methods. LDAP, that's Microsoft's lightweight directory access protocol. When you log on to Microsoft Access Server, when you're logging on to with your ID and password, that LDAP protocol is what's looking up and comparing your password, encrypting it, comparing, kicking off other encryption math to make sure it matches what's in Active Directory, that you have the right password. And Kerberos, remember we talked about Kerberos earlier on in the logic section, access control section, that module. Kerberos has the ticketing system, getting a ticket for a ticket and getting the approval. These are all authentication protocols. 802.1x, that's the authentication for wireless, where you use a particular port. You lock down your wireless access to a particular physical port, but you need a radius server, which is essentially just an authentication server, like Microsoft Active Directory. It could be Microsoft Active Directory even. So these are different kinds of authentication protocols that prove that the person logging on with their ID and password is in fact the right person, or at least the credentials match. I mean, they could be stolen, obviously, but but it's trying to authenticate the ID and the password, whether it's the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, LDAP by Microsoft, Kerberos, at the network level, getting the tickets to access tickets to get to the right server that you're entitled to get to, or whether you're using wireless or this radius server, authentication server with the 802.1x protocol for wireless. So again, it's a lot of information. These protocols, it's difficult to sort of envision how they're all working together, but each one is like a different tool for a different problem. And you don't really have to worry so much about how they're all interfacing and how they're all mixed and how they're nested necessarily, because they are sort of nested and kicking each other off, but that gets pretty complicated. But just be happy to understand the different kinds of encryption and the different kinds of authentication and these different protocols and what they do, even if you just understand individually how they work, because it is difficult to understand how they're all nested and working together. Okay, there are two concepts here on this slide. The left slide is new. The right side is really a summary of Diffie-Hellman. Let's look at the left side for a second. The left side is really a digital signature scenario. It's different than when you're shopping on Amazon or doing work with the bank, processing it's a transaction. In this case, Alice, here in this slide on the left, she's initiating a contract to pay for $500, let's say. So she's going to use her private key. She's initiating this transaction. She's going to encrypt her message that she'll pay $500. She encrypts it with her red private key on the left-hand side of the screen. She sends the encrypted message, DEFCD, that blue in the middle. Bob gets it. Bob gets that with her public key, and then he de-encrypts with Alice's public key and can read the contract and sign it. So it's kind of the reverse of what we saw earlier with shopping and e-commerce and banking, where the customer pulls down the public key, initiates the transaction, the encryption with the public key, sends the encrypted message back to the bank, who holds the private key and de-encrypts. With a digital signature, it's sort of the reverse scenario, where the person initiating the contract has both the public and the private key. Alice has the public and the private key. She's initiating the contract. She signs it with her private key, sends the contract over with her public key to Bob and anyone else she's doing contract work with, and she de-encrypts it with the public key in the bottom of that chart on the left. So there's that's called non-repudiation. Alice and Bob can't say they weren't involved because these keys were used to encrypt and validate who they were. The right-hand side of the screen is really a simple version of Diffie-Hellman. Right? If you look at that, Alice and Bob start with two different keys. They start with the asymmetric. They get combined. The combined key, which was the dark brown key in that earlier slide we saw, they get the same key in this case in the middle of the right hand. You look at the picture here on the right hand side of the slide. Alice, under the Diffie-Hellman key exchange box here, they have the same combined key. It says combined key, but they're the same. But the combined key was never sent over the internet, right? And then we saw that probably in better detail in that earlier slide with the colors. And then they both have the encryption that's the same. They both have a shared key they can decrypt with on the right hand side. So then it's sort of a simpler version of what we saw earlier with the first Diffie-Hellman slide we saw with the colors. So that's sort of just a review of Diffie-Hellman on the right side of the slide and a simplification of how it works. The left hand side is how asymmetric public-private keys work with digital signatures, and it's sort of the reverse process of e-commerce or banking. We've been focusing on asymmetric encryption, and the asymmetric encryption is that public-private key, the public-private key infrastructure that's used where the private key is held by the bank or the place you're doing business with, like Amazon or Walmart, and the public key is sent down to the customer or the participant to encrypt. But that's sort of, there's some overhead in that authentication process using asymmetric keys. So once you've already authenticated, there are symmetric block keys that are used for subsequent communication in the session. you've authenticated, there's lots of information, you're shopping, you're looking at different products, you're going back and forth, you're putting things into your shopping cart. That's all symmetric block encryption because it's more efficient. The symmetric using one key is more efficient for that kind of encryption. As a side note, and it says it here in this slide, but just so you fully understand, even though I'm not going to quiz you on this level of detail, but these symmetric block encryption keys are actually created with asymmetric keys and encrypted with asymmetric keys. But because it's a block encryption process, it's very efficient. But the main takeaway from this slide is that the symmetric block encryption keys are used subsequent to the authentication with the public-private key asymmetric process. And you can see in the bottom, main advantage, the reason why the symmetric blocks are used, it's faster to compute. It's often combined with asymmetric encryption, which we talked about. And on the right-hand side, we talk about weaknesses. It's a single key. It's not a pair of keys, so it's a little easier to brute force. So that's why you use it with the Diffie-Hellman method. Specifically, on the bottom right-hand side, ECDHE, elliptical curve, Diffie-Hellman ephemeral. That's usually what you'll see on the internet. Now that you have an understanding of symmetric block encryption, what are the actual algorithms that are used? The first one you see here, if you see this on the internet, DES or 3DES, DES or 3DES, this is sort of obsolete. You shouldn't be using that. It may be out there somewhere, but it would be an older site that has never been updated. But AES is the standard for symmetric keys, and there's some specs here if you're interested in how this works. And on the last bullet on the left-hand side, AES can have 10 to 14 cycles of encryption. So basically what that's saying is it encrypts, it takes the result, encrypts it again, takes the result, encrypts it again, etc. So for 10 to 14 cycles. So that's very secure. You can see in the picture on the right, there's a little diagram that shows the encryption and decryption on both sides of the equation, on both sides of the internet cloud. It's the same key. Key A from the sender, key A for the recipient, etc. Just to sort of reinforce that concept that it's one key for these transactions. These older encryption methods, symmetric block encryption keys, are not really used much. Blowfish, two fish, and three fish sounds like a cat in a hat story. But I just put some details here for those who are curious. These aren't commonly used, and this is nothing that you'd see on an exam from me at any rate. But you might see this possibly on a security plus exam. But I'm not even sure they go through these algorithms anymore because they're really not used much anymore. Here's a quick summary of asymmetric versus symmetric encryption. So RSA is clearly asymmetric. It creates the public-private key. These two keys that are mathematically connected that can encrypt and de-encrypt the same message, even though there's a public key and a private key that are different keys. Public key is obviously for all the customers, constituents, participants with a bank or a shopping site like Amazon or Walmart. And the private key obviously is kept private by that entity. And Diffie-Hellman, the elliptical curve Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, the ECDHE key exchange, is also considered asymmetric because it relies on the two different asymmetric keys to be used and passed as a third sort of symmetric secret key, like we saw in that color chart, that slide that had the colors with the two Alice and Bob starting out with the secret keys, secret asymmetric keys. So it's based on asymmetric. So Diffie-Hellman is still considered asymmetric, but it's really not so much considered a mathematical encryption algorithm, more like a key exchange process. So RSA and Diffie-Hellman are considered asymmetric, and then AES is really symmetric. And you can see on the lower half of the slide, it also includes 3DES and Blowfish, but those are much less commonly used today. So this is sort of a nice quick summary of which algorithms are symmetric and asymmetric. You should be aware of this process called salting to add complexity to your password. So let's say you have a password, Apple, you're establishing it. You're creating this Apple password. The system will append a salt to it, YRT capital ZD, random elements. And it stores that YRTZD in this great database on the bottom. If you notice the bottom part, there's a little arrow that says the salt is not hashed. There's a reason it's not hashed. You'll see why in a second. And now the system hashes your entire password, the apple with the salt, and the result is the orange box to the right. So it added complexity to your password. It added some characters you're not even aware about. And it does this because you're going to learn later in the module on threats and vulnerabilities about how passwords are hacked with what's called a rainbow table. And it'll just you'll learn more about the rainbow table in that module, but adding this salt and adding this complexity to your password makes it more difficult to find a match in these rainbow tables and figure out what your password is. So the next time you go to log on, you type in Apple, unbeknownst to you, the system pulls out then YRZD, adds it, appends it to your Apple password, goes through the hashing algorithm in the middle of this picture, and creates the identical hash that was created initially, and you're allowed into the system. There's also a variation of salts called peppers, and see the bottom right hand corner, we have a little video on this you'll see later. And the pepper is a variation where the pepper is hashed with the password. But these are all techniques. The salting and the peppering is to add complexity to your password. So if you did use something that was sort of a simple phrase or term, too simple, it might show up in a rainbow table, and the hacker might be able to figure out with the matching hash in his or her rainbow table to figure out what you've typed in, what your password is. And you'll learn more about these rainbow tables in a latter module when we talk about malware and threats and vulnerabilities. Key stretching is another technique to add complexity to your password. So your password is hashed, and then there's a result, and then it gets hashed again. And that result gets hashed again. And it could be a dozen times, hashing a hash over and over again to make it very complex, again, to make it difficult for a hacker to find your hashed value in one of their rainbow tables, which we'll talk about, as I said earlier, in another module. The rainbow tables is a database of billions of hashes, and a hacker tries to find your hash that he stole, tries to match that against that rainbow table to see what your term was, what your password was that was encrypted. So the two algorithms for stretching are this password-based key derivation function, PBKDF2, and bcrypt, based on the blowfish algorithm. So those are the two, the mathematical sort of algorithms that are built into a lot of these encryption algorithms to create this hashing of hashes. Password gets hashed again, the result gets hashed again, that hash result gets hashed again. It makes things pretty complicated, pretty complex passwords. This is old school, one-time pad it's called, but this is still a very effective way to encrypt. So this was invented in 1917 to encrypt teletype communications. And essentially, whatever the process, formula, calculation is to decrypt, it's written down on a piece of paper, and it's given to another person, the recipient of the message. And that it's not scalable, right? Someone's got to write it out and give it to somebody, but they're pretty hard to break because no one really knows. It's never passed anywhere. It's never in a database. It's just a piece of paper. The other person may secretly hide that paper or may memorize and destroy it. So it's truly random. It's truly secret. There are only 2 copies, which may be kept very secretively or may even be destroyed if it's memorized. So not scalable, but still used for certain situations. We very briefly touched upon the subject of certificate authorities when we were in the wireless security module, and we were talking about the 802.1x protocol that's used to create additional security for wireless by assigning a particular physical port on the back of a router that your WAP, your wireless access device, can only use that port to get entry to your network. And beneath that bullet, there was some details. I wouldn't put on a test, but some details about some variation about how 802.1x can be implemented for wireless security, and it touched upon this concept of certificates. So let's talk about that. This slide really talks about certificate authorities, and these are companies like you see in the second bullet: Symantec, GoDaddy, Verizon. There's lots of them that are out there, and you pay them, and they give you your public and private keys, and they verify that you are in fact the person you're representing on that website. So it adds a lot of sort of a trust when you go to a website and you see that they have an HTTPS. And the HTTPS means that they're using security. And if you notice on the bottom, I have this little Amazon logo, this Amazon website URL, and there's a little green lock. If you click on that green lock, or maybe a different color, you'll see the certificate and who provided it. So you'll see it was Symantec or Verizon, or someone provided that or Entrust provided that the keys. So you know they're valid, secure, strong encryption keys, asymmetric keys, and you know that the person that's representing on that website is in fact the right person. That this is, if you're going to the Amazon website, they certify this truly is the Amazon company that's representing and hosting this Amazon website. So it does two things for you. It knows that it tells you that the keys are a good, strong, asymmetric pair, private, public keys, and also that this is the right entity. So that's really the purpose of these certificate authorities, to do that. And it's not that expensive. It's about $20 a year or something per certificate. Now, when you click on that little green icon there at the bottom of the screen, there's a protocol that runs called OCPS. It's in the last bullet here. And the OCPS is actually the protocol that's going to be able to display the details of that certificate. And you can try this on a URL with any URL. And the details of that certificate and who issued it and the kinds of encryption will be displayed. And OCPS is looking for, we'll see this in the next slide, a particular format. So the certificate is in a particular format, and we're going to see that in the next slide. And OCPS can read that standard format. So all the certificate authorities, when they create these digital certificates and they give them out to websites to use for security, for encryption, they all have to have this, the certificate authorities must publish them in this particular format we'll see on the next slide. So that when you click on this little green icon on the bottom of this screen and the OCPS protocol runs, it can read the standard electronic format of the certificate, and you can read the details about this website's security. This is an example of a certificate. This is actually IBM's. So if you go to IBM.com and click on that little green lock or gray lock, depending on your browser, you could see the certificate. And you could click through View Certificate on the right-hand side of this image and see more details. But you can see it was issued by DigiCert, and it's going to expire September 2022. Generally, these certificates are good for a year or 2 years. And you can, if you look further down, you'll see things that look a little familiar to you. TLS, right? That's part of the security operation of HTTPS. Sometimes it's called SSL TLS. AES, you know, that's a semantic encryption. And you see SHA, that's SHA-384. That's for hashing. So it's starting to make a little sense to you as you go through this course. So when you pay for a digital certificate like this, it's issued in this format of X.509, and the protocol OCSP can display it. So it's all standard. Now you can create your own certificates, but you're not going to have a third party validating who you are and that your keys are valid, because that's what this is really doing, right? It's validating that IBM, the company IBM, is actually that is the company hosting IBM.com. So you know it's valid, it's the authentic company, and you know the keys are strong keys that are really coming from you know, this digital authority that's providing state-of-the-art keys for encryption. But you can create your own certificates, and sometimes people do it for internal sites that are not exposed to the internet. I don't think many people or anyone would advise creating your own keys and your own self-signed certificate for the external world, but internally you might, to save money. So you might use a Microsoft server, or there's a site called OpenSSL, right? Because SSL/TLS, that's the protocol that's kicking off security for HTTPS. So when you see the S by HTTPS, the S means security, It means it's using SSL/TLS. That's a protocol that's going to kick off a series of other protocols for your encryption that we've talked about, all these different kinds of algorithms that do the encryption. So, but you can create your own self-signed certificate. The third party is not representing that you are who you are, and the keys you're generating on your own. You probably wouldn't do this for a public site, but you might do it to save money for your internal intranets where your company employees are accessing various sites that are only available to employees. You might create your own certificates using Microsoft Server or OpenSSL. So that's the story on certificates, and they provide the ability for people to have some trust in the website that they're going to when they see a third party provided this certificate. Here, this graphic just shows the steps in sequential order. In the middle of the screen shows the SSL certificate, the security certificate that's being moved from the hosting service on the right-hand side to the user that requested the public key. And that certificate is tied to the web host on the right-hand bottom of the screen, the right-hand bottom corner, tied to that user. So it really cannot be used. That public key can't be used by another site. It's tied to this site. So you can't steal the public key for Amazon and use it for some other purpose. It's tied to the Amazon IP address and other characteristics. These are the videos you should take a look at. Some of the subjects that we talked about in the presentation will help you sort of understand how these technologies and processes work by looking at these brief videos.